Have you ever wondered why one of the most important figures of early Christianity simply disappears from the historical record after the resurrection? Mary Magdalene, the first witness of the risen Christ according to all four canonical Gospels, the woman who stood at the foot of the cross when almost all the male disciples had fled, the one who received the direct mission to announce the resurrection to the apostles, simply vanishes from the Acts of the Apostles as if she had never existed. Not a mention, not a reference to her fate, not a word about where she went after that transformative encounter in the garden. This silence is not accidental, it is deliberate, it is strategic, and it hides something that the official history of Christianity has kept concealed for almost 2,000 years. Because according to traditions preserved in southern France, traditions documented by local communities for more than 1,000 years, Mary Magdalene did not disappear. She fled, and she arrived at a very specific place that would become her last earthly refuge. The caves of Saint-Baume, located in the mountains of Provence in southern France, about 50 kilometers from Marseille, have been a site of uninterrupted pilgrimage since at least the 5th century after Christ, not by papal decree, not by official ecclesiastical mandate, but because local communities preserved a memory they never forgot. Mary Magdalene spent the last 30 years of her life in that cave. The Provençal tradition, documented in medieval texts such as the Golden Legend by Jacopo de Varazze in the 13th century, tells a very specific story. After the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene, along with Mary Salome, Mary of Jacob, Lazarus, Martha, and others from Christ's inner circle, were captured by the authorities. But instead of executing them publicly and creating martyrs who would strengthen the Christian movement, they employed a more sinister method. They placed them in a boat without oars or sails and cast them into the Mediterranean Sea. Officially, they had not executed them. If they drowned, it was divine will. According to tradition, the boat miraculously reached the shores of what is now Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer in southern France. And Mary Magdalene did not come alone. She brought with her something far more dangerous than her testimony about the resurrection. She brought the continuation of the most sacred lineage in human history. Archaeological evidence confirms that the cave of Saint-Baume was indeed a very ancient Christian cult center, long before the Vatican officially recognized any sanctuary in France. The oldest inscriptions found on the cave walls date from the 5th century, but geological analyses of the usage marks suggest that the place was continuously inhabited from an earlier time. In the Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, a few kilometers from the cave, relics are preserved that, according to tradition, belong to Mary Magdalene. They were miraculously discovered in 1279 by Charles of Anjou, Prince of Salerno. Convenient? Yes. But popular devotion to this place preceded by centuries this official discovery. Local communities already knew, they already venerated, they already preserved the memory of what had really happened in that cave. But there is something that official traditions never mention. Something that was carefully omitted from all ecclesiastical records. Mary Magdalene did not spend those 30 years in contemplative and passive silence. According to traditions preserved by communities that never completely knelt before Rome, she taught, she received visitors, she formed disciples, she transmitted knowledge she had received directly from Christ. And most importantly, she prepared her own children to continue a mission that ecclesiastical authorities were desperate to destroy, because what you are going to discover in the next few minutes is not simply a romantic story about the exile of a saint. It is the revelation of the last words that Mary Magdalene spoke to her children before dying, words so dangerous that they required 2,000 years of brutal censorship to try to erase them from human memory. Words that, had they survived in the official narrative, would have completely changed the course of Christianity. Words that explained who she really was, what relationship she had with Jesus, and what truth her descendants carried. But above all, words that revealed something that no religious institution based on control could tolerate, the truth that the divine needs no intermediaries. Now that you understand that Mary Magdalene was not alone in that French refuge, we need to talk about the names that were deliberately erased from official history, the children she protected with her life, the heirs of the most sacred and dangerous lineage in humanity. The first of these names we have already mentioned in previous investigations, Sarah the Black. But what they never told you is that Sarah was not simply a child who accompanied Mary Magdalene on the journey from Palestine. According to traditions preserved by Romani gypsy communities, traditions transmitted orally for more than 1,000 years, Sarah was the daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the biological bearer of the messianic lineage. Every year, on the 24th and 25th of May, thousands of gypsies from all over Europe converge on Sainte Marie de la Mer to honor Sarah la Kali in a celebration that has continued uninterrupted since the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church officially describes Sarah as an Egyptian servant of the Marys. But gypsy communities know something different, something they transmit from generation to generation, far from ecclesiastical ears. Sarah was not a servant. She was a princess of the Davidic lineage. Her very name declares it. Sarah means princess in Hebrew, connecting directly with Sarah, the wife of Abraham, the matriarch through whom passed the promise of the blessed descendants. But there was another child, one whose name appears in medieval texts preserved in manuscripts of the Order of the Temple, Maximin. According to Templar documents discovered in monastic archives of southern France, Maximin was the male child of Mary Magdalene, born in France several years after her arrival. His name appears in medieval Acts of the Saints, not as a son, but strategically disguised as a companion or disciple of Magdalene. But researchers who analyze these texts with modern linguistic methodology, including studies by Dr. Margaret Starbird, a specialist in messianic lineage symbolism, identified revealing patterns. The descriptions of the relationship between Magdalene and Maximin use the same familial language that other medieval texts employ for mother-son relationships, not master-disciple. And there is something more. The name Maximin means the greatest in Latin. Why would a simple disciple receive a name that implies supremacy or preeminence, unless that name was signaling something that could not be said openly, that he was the heir of the most important lineage in history? These two children, Sarah and Maximin, were the receivers of Mary Magdalene's last teachings, the words she spoke on her deathbed, knowing that ecclesiastical authorities were systematically hunting any evidence of the sacred lineage. But why did these names have to be erased so completely? Because they represented something that destroyed the foundations of the institutional power that the Church was building. If Christ had established a bloodline on earth, then the connection with the divine flowed through descendants, not through ecclesiastical institutions. If the sacred was transmitted from father to son, from mother to daughter, then why was a pope needed? Why bishops who determined doctrine? Why priests who administered controlled sacraments? If Mary Magdalene taught that the kingdom is within you and that each person has direct access to gnosis, then their entire structure of obligatory mediation becomes irrelevant. Worse still, it reveals itself as what it really is, not a path to God, but an obstacle. Not spiritual liberation, but institutional control. That is why the response could not simply be to disagree with these teachings. They had to be eradicated, completely, violently, without leaving a trace. The mere existence of Sarah and Maximin demonstrated that the divine walked on earth, flowed through human blood, continued generation after generation. And this truth was so dangerous that it required not only censorship, but complete eradication from historical memory. The Templars knew this secret. They discovered it during their excavations under Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and that is why their secret devotion to Mary Magdalene was not simply veneration of a saint. It was recognition that she had carried and protected the sacred lineage. The Holy Grail they sought was not a physical chalice from the Last Supper. It was the sang real, the royal blood that flowed through Sarah and Maximin, the lineage that Mary Magdalene protected until her last breath. And the words she transmitted to them before dying were the final testament of this forbidden truth. We are living in days when prophecies are being fulfilled before our very eyes, but most still walk in darkness, trapped in incomplete truths that have been carefully hidden from humanity for centuries. Now think, what if precisely what was eliminated from the scriptures contains the answers you have been seeking for years, answers that can illuminate your path, strengthen your faith, and reveal the true purpose of Jesus' coming? To understand what exactly Mary Magdalene said to her children, we need to examine a document that the Church tried to destroy for 1600 years, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. In 1896, a German scholar named Karl Reinhardt purchased an ancient codex in an antiquities market in Cairo. This manuscript, now known as the Berlin Codex 8502, contained a text that official Christendom had declared lost forever. But this gospel was not lost by accident. According to researchers at Harvard University, especially Dr. Karen King, this text was systematically suppressed during the early centuries of Christianity because it contained teachings that directly contradicted the power structure that Peter was establishing. The text begins with an extraordinary scene. After the resurrection, the disciples are terrified and confused. Mary Magdalene consoles them and begins to share teachings that Jesus had given her in private, teachings that the other disciples had not heard. Peter reacts with fury. Did the Savior speak with a woman in secret, without our knowledge and not openly? Must we change our customs and all listen to this woman? But Levi defends Mary. Peter, you have always been impulsive. Now I see you competing with this woman as if she were your adversary. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? This conflict was not about abstract doctrines. It was about authority, about who had the right to teach, about who carried the deepest truths of Christ's message. And Mary Magdalene clearly possessed something that threatened the male leadership that Peter was trying to consolidate. But there are fragments of the text that are even more revealing. In a preserved section, Mary describes a vision about the ascension of the soul and the nature of sin. She teaches that sin is not a moral stain requiring institutional absolution. It is ignorance, it is forgetfulness of our true divine nature. And salvation does not come through external mediators, but through inner knowledge, through gnosis that reconnects the soul with its source. These teachings made the entire machinery of ecclesiastical control completely unnecessary. You don't need to confess before a priest if sin is simply ignorance that dissipates with knowledge. You don't need sacraments controlled by hierarchy if salvation lies in recognizing your own inner divinity. You don't need blind obedience to institutional authorities if truth is accessed directly through gnosis. That is why this gospel had to disappear. But there was something more in the text, something that surviving copies did not completely preserve, but that fragmentary references suggest. According to analyses of related texts discovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945, the Gospel of Mary originally contained sections about the private teachings she transmitted to those of her blood. This cryptic phrase, those of her blood, appears in multiple Gnostic texts, and scholars who studied the familial language of 2nd century Greek, including researchers at Claremont University, confirm that this expression typically referred to direct descendants, not spiritual disciples. Mary Magdalene was transmitting teachings specifically to her children, knowledge she had received from Christ and was now passing to the sacred lineage. And these teachings, according to fragments preserved in Gnostic oral traditions, included something that no religious institution could tolerate: the truth that Christ did not come to establish a new religion with temples and hierarchies. He came to reveal that the divine already dwells in every human being, that the kingdom of heaven is not in the future nor in heaven, it is within, now, always, and that any institution that stands between you and that inner truth is stealing your divine inheritance. This is what Mary Magdalene taught in that forbidden gospel, and this is exactly what she transmitted to Sarah and Maximine before dying. The words that would explain why her message was so dangerous that it required 2,000 years of censorship to try to erase it. Have you heard about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the teachings that were censored? Tell me in the comments. I am fascinated to know how much true truth seekers like you know. Your experience can illuminate others who are just awakening to these revelations. But why was the lineage so crucial? Why did Mary Magdalene need to transmit these teachings specifically to her children and not simply to any disciple? To understand this, we need to comprehend something fundamental about 1st century Judaism that most modern Christians are completely unaware of. The Messiah was not simply a spiritual teacher. He was the legitimate heir to David's throne, destined to restore the kingdom of Israel and establish an eternal lineage. The messianic prophecies in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the Psalms are explicit about this. Isaiah 9:7 declares, "Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it." Psalm 89:4 promises, "I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations." These were not spiritual metaphors for the 1st century Jewish audience. They were literal promises of perpetual lineage. The Messiah would have descendants who would continue his mission through the generations. That is why the Gospels of Matthew and Luke open with detailed genealogies tracing Jesus' lineage to David, not to satisfy historical curiosity, but to establish his messianic legitimacy according to the prophecies. But here is what the official narrative never explains satisfactorily. If Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, and if the prophecies promised that his lineage would be eternal, how is that promise fulfilled if he never had descendants? The traditional theological answer is that the lineage is spiritual, not biological, that the descendants are believers adopted into God's family. But this interpretation only emerged centuries later, when the institutional church needed to justify why there were no physical heirs. The oldest texts, especially those discovered at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, present a completely different understanding. The Essenes, the community that probably produced these manuscripts, expected a Messiah who would establish a permanent priestly and royal lineage, not an abstract celestial kingdom, but an earthly restoration of the Davidic order. And when we examine Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Philip, we find specific references to the sacred bridal chamber and the mystery of marriage that generated fruits of light. This was not purely symbolic language. It was the description of a sacred union between the masculine Christ and the feminine Sophia, represented by Mary Magdalene, that would literally produce descendants carrying the divine spark. This understanding is what Mary Magdalene transmitted to Sarah and Maximin, that they were not simply biological children of an ordinary human relationship. They were the continuation of the messianic lineage promised in the prophecies. They carried in their blood the direct connection with the divine that had been incarnated in Christ, and their mission was to preserve and transmit this lineage so that the prophetic promise would be fulfilled. Your seed shall be established forever. This is what made their existence so dangerous to ecclesiastical authorities. Because if the messianic lineage continued through Sarah and Maximin, mixing with humanity generation after generation, then the divine was not confined to inaccessible celestial institutions. It was walking on earth, flowing through human blood, available directly without mediators. And the words that Mary Magdalene spoke to her children before dying were precisely about this truth, about their sacred identity, about their responsibility to preserve the lineage, about the teachings they must transmit to future generations, words that connected ancient prophecies with humanity's destiny, words that explained why their lineage was not a separate elite, but a seed destined to mix widely with humanity until all recognized their own divine nature. The systematic suppression of truth. Now that you understand what Mary Magdalene transmitted to her children, we need to understand how these teachings were systematically erased from official history. The moment that changed everything, the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 after Christ. Officially, this council was convened by Emperor Constantine to resolve theological controversies about the nature of Christ and unify Christian doctrine throughout the Roman Empire. But what really happened at Nicaea was something far more sinister. It was the moment when Christianity ceased to be a diverse spiritual movement with multiple interpretations and became an imperial religion controlled by the state. And one of the most consequential decisions was to determine which texts would be included in the official canon of the New Testament and which would be prohibited and destroyed. According to research by Dr. Bart Ehrman, professor at the University of North Carolina and one of the most respected scholars in early Christianity, before Nicaea there were dozens of Gospels and sacred texts circulating among Christian communities. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, dozens of others. There was no official and universally accepted New Testament. Each community had its own collections of sacred texts, its own traditions, its own interpretations. But this was unacceptable to Constantine. He had not adopted Christianity out of deep spiritual conviction. He adopted it as a political tool to unify an empire that was crumbling, and a religious movement with dozens of contradictory interpretations did not serve that purpose. He needed a single controllable version that reinforced imperial authority instead of questioning it. The criteria for selecting which texts would be inspired by God and which would be heretical were not primarily spiritual, they were political. The texts included in the official canon shared specific characteristics. First, they reinforced the authority of the male ecclesiastical hierarchy. Second, they presented a clear line of apostolic succession that legitimized the power of bishops. Third, they minimized or completely eliminated the role of women in spiritual leadership. Fourth, they rejected the idea that direct knowledge of God was available to any believer without the need for institutional intermediaries. Texts that did not meet these criteria were declared heretical, and they were not simply excluded from the canon, they were actively destroyed. Constantine issued a decree ordering that all Gnostic texts be burned. Possessing copies of forbidden Gospels became a crime punishable by death. Entire libraries were set on fire. The Great Library of Alexandria, which contained thousands of early Christian manuscripts, was destroyed in successive waves of state-sponsored violence. Entire communities that refused to renounce their sacred texts were massacred. And among all the texts that were prohibited and destroyed, those that mentioned Mary Magdalene as a spiritual leader, as a bearer of secret teachings, as Christ's companion, were pursued with special ferocity, because they revealed a truth that destroyed the narrative that Constantine and the bishops were building. The early church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote the ecclesiastical history shortly after the Council of Nicaea, mentions dozens of early Christian figures in great detail, but of Mary Magdalene, only a few lines about her presence at the resurrection, and then absolute silence about her fate, her ministry, her death. This was not accidental forgetfulness. It was deliberate censorship. Eusebius had access to complete libraries of early Christian documents that are now lost. He knew the traditions about Mary Magdalene. He knew the texts that presented her as a leader. He knew the stories about her lineage. And he deliberately chose to omit all of this from his official history. Because for institutional Christianity to function as a tool of imperial control, Mary Magdalene had to be neutralized. She could not be completely eliminated from the Gospels because her presence at crucial events was too well known in early Christian communities. So the strategy was different: transform her. In the year 591 AD, Pope Gregory I delivered a sermon that would change Mary Magdalene's image for the next 1400 years. He declared that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the sinful woman mentioned in Luke 7 were the same person. There was absolutely no biblical evidence for this claim, but with that papal declaration, Mary Magdalene was officially transformed into a repentant prostitute. The apostle to the apostles became the symbol of the sexual sinner redeemed by male grace. Her spiritual authority was erased, her leadership was forgotten, her role as Christ's companion was censored, and any mention of descendants, of teachings transmitted to her children, of sacred lineage, was pursued as the most dangerous heresy. The words she spoke to Sarah and Maximine before dying were exactly those that this new narrative needed to suppress. Words about spiritual autonomy, about the inner kingdom that requires no mediators, about the sacred lineage that flows through humanity. Words that, had they survived, would have made impossible the institutional control that Nicaea established. That is why they were silenced with a violence that would extend for centuries. If these revelations are touching your heart deeply, I invite you to join our exclusive club of members. Here you will find a brotherhood of seekers who, like you, do not settle for incomplete truths. Become a member now. The 3 forbidden teachings. Although complete texts have been destroyed, fragments of Mary Magdalene's teachings survived in oral traditions preserved by Gnostic and Cathar communities. And when we reconstruct these fragments, 3 central teachings emerge that she transmitted to her children before dying. 3 truths that were so dangerous to institutional power that they required centuries of brutal censorship. Teaching 1. Guard the gnosis. The inner light cannot be extinguished. According to parallels with Gnostic texts about last teachings, Mary Magdalene would have said something similar to this. My children, what I have taught you does not come from me. It comes from the Master whom I knew, loved, and who revealed to me the mysteries of the kingdom. He told me, and now I tell you, the light you seek is not in stone temples raised by human hands. It is in the temple of flesh that you yourselves are. No one can give you this light because you have already possessed it since the beginning of time. You need only awaken to it. And when you awaken, do not allow anyone to tell you that you need intermediaries to reach the Father. He who says only through me will you reach God seeks to place himself in God's place. He who makes you fear your own direct connection with the divine is enslaving you. This teaching about gnosis, direct inner knowledge, was the foundation of everything else. It appears in the Gospel of Thomas, in the Gospel of Truth, in the Gospel of Philip. It was not a later invention. It was a central part of the original message that Mary Magdalene had received and was now transmitting to her children. Teaching 2. The woman who knows her essence is equal to man. This teaching was the most dangerous to ecclesiastical authorities because it validated not only the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, but presented it as a sacred model of divine union. According to linguistic analyses of first-century Gnostic phraseology, conducted by researchers at Claremont University, traditions about this teaching preserved a specific pattern. Mary Magdalene would have spoken of the sacred bridal chamber, a Gnostic concept that represented the union of divine opposites, not simply a human marriage, but the reunification of the masculine logos with the feminine Sophia. And she would have taught that Sarah and Maximine were the fruits of that sacred union, bearers of both divine natures in perfect balance. The love that the Master and I shared was not sin, though they will call it so. Those who fear the power of the sacred feminine, it was the restoration of divine unity that existed before the world was divided into opposites. And you, my children, are living proof that the divine is not separated from the flesh. It is not confined to distant heavens. It walks on earth. It lives in blood. It is transmitted from generation to generation. You carry in your bodies the spark that unites heaven and earth. Do not allow anyone to tell you that you are less sacred for having been born of human union. You are more sacred precisely because of this. This teaching demolished the distinction that the institutional church was building between the pure spiritual and the corrupt carnal. If the union between Christ and Magdalene was sacred, if it produced divine descendants, then flesh was not the enemy of spirit. It was its vehicle, its expression, its continuation on earth. Teaching 3. Fear not those who persecute the body, protect the spirit. Mary Magdalene knew that persecution would come. She had already seen how Roman and Jewish authorities had crucified Jesus. She had already experienced the forced exile that brought her to France. She already knew that Christian communities were dividing between those who preserved the original teachings and those who built structures of institutional power. According to traditions preserved by Provençal communities, her last words included a prophetic warning. There will come a time when those who say they speak in the Master's name will persecute those who truly keep his teachings. They will burn books, they will destroy communities, they will kill the bearers of gnosis. They will say they do it for God, but they do it for earthly power. When that time comes, and it will come, do not fear the death of the body. The body is temporal, gnosis is eternal. If 1,000 bearers of light die, the light itself cannot be extinguished, because it lives not in scrolls that can be burned, nor in temples that can be destroyed. It lives in every soul that awakens to its true nature. Protect the spirit, transmit the teaching, preserve the memory. And though 1,000 years of darkness pass, the light will eventually shine again. This prophecy was fulfilled with terrible precision. The Gnostics were persecuted in the 4th century. The Cathars were massacred in the 13th century. The Templars were destroyed in the 14th century. Every community that preserved these teachings was hunted, tortured, executed, but the light was not extinguished. Because Mary Magdalene had taught correctly, gnosis does not live in institutions that can be destroyed. It lives in hearts that refuse to forget. And now, 2,000 years later, that light is emerging again. Sarah, the Black, the guardian of the mysteries. Now we need to understand why Sarah specifically was designated as the principal guardian of these teachings, and why her identification as the Black has much deeper meanings than the official narrative admits. Every year on the 24th and 25th of May, the small town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer is transformed. Thousands of Romani gypsies from all over Europe converge for the annual pilgrimage to Sara la Kali. They carry her statue from the church crypt to the Mediterranean Sea in a procession that has continued uninterrupted for more than 1,000 years. They submerge her in the waves, while singing in Romani words that the church has never been able to fully translate or control. This is not a simple folkloric festival. It is an act of spiritual resistance, a ritual of preserved memory, a declaration that the truth about Sarah was never completely erased. But why the Black? The official explanation is that Sarah had dark skin. Possibly she was Egyptian or Ethiopian, and there is historical evidence that supports this possibility. Jewish communities of Alexandria in the 1st century included many people of African descent. If Mary Magdalene had lived sometime in Egypt, according to some traditions, before arriving in France, it is possible that Sarah was born there and had African heritage. But according to anthropological studies by Dr. Patrick Williams of the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, a specialist in Romani culture, the term the Black had another meaning in medieval symbolism. Black represented the occult, the underground, the wisdom that remained hidden from authorities but visible to initiates. The Black Madonnas that appear in more than 500 places in Europe, concentrated especially in France, are not simply statues that darkened with time. Modern chemical analyses confirm that many were deliberately carved in dark wood or painted black from their creation. They represented Gnostic knowledge, divine feminine wisdom, the hidden aspect of the sacred. And Sarah was the Black because she was the bearer of the hidden teaching, the knowledge that could not be proclaimed openly but had to be preserved in the shadows, transmitted from generation to generation, far from ecclesiastical eyes. But there is a third level of even deeper meaning. In Egyptian esoteric traditions that mixed with early Christianity, especially in Alexandria, the goddess Isis was represented with black skin when she appeared in her aspect as Isis the Wise. Isis was the mother goddess, the bearer of mysteries, the one who resurrected her divine consort Osiris. The first Christian representations of Mary with the child Jesus are directly based on iconography of Isis with Horus, and Mary Magdalene, in Gnostic traditions, was seen as the incarnation of Sophia Isis, the divine feminine wisdom. Sarah, as her daughter, inherited that archetype. She was the new bearer of the mysteries that Isis, Sophia Magdalene, had guarded. That is why communities that venerated Sarah did not see her simply as a child who accompanied her mother. They saw her as the initiated guardian, the one who had received the secret teachings in their totality, the one who would continue the line of hidden wisdom. And the gypsy communities, who never completely submitted to ecclesiastical control, who lived on the margins of European society, who preserved oral traditions that institutions could not censor. They became the perfect guardians of Sarah's memory, because they had nothing to lose by keeping alive a truth that authorities wanted to destroy. They had no institutions to protect. They had no hierarchies to justify. They had no political power to preserve. They had only the truth, and they transmitted it from generation to generation with a fidelity that no ecclesiastical institution could match. That is why 2,000 years later, when all power structures tried to erase Sarah from history, it is the gypsies, the marginalized, the persecuted, those who have no official voice, who still preserve her memory. And in that annual ritual of submerging her statue in the sea, they are reenacting something profoundly symbolic: Mary Magdalene's journey across the Mediterranean, the arrival of the sacred lineage on the shores of France, and the promise that the truth, though submerged under waves of censorship for 2 millennia, would eventually resurface. Where are you watching this video from? It moves me to know that these truths are reaching thirsty souls around the world, right where you are watching from. Let's form a global network of truth seekers. Now we come to the heart of this millennial mystery, the last words that Mary Magdalene spoke to her children before dying. No complete text survived. Ecclesiastical authorities were meticulous in their destruction, but fragments preserved in oral traditions, veiled references in Gnostic texts, and patterns in the secret iconography of persecuted communities allow us to reconstruct the final testament. Not word for word, that would be impossible and dishonest to claim. But yes, the essence, the central message, the truths she considered so crucial that she spoke them with her last breath. According to Cathar traditions preserved in Inquisition records, extracted under torture from the last perfecti before they were burned, Mary Magdalene gathered Sarah, Maximin, and her closest disciples when she felt death approaching, and she transmitted to them what traditions called the 3 keys of the hidden kingdom. First key: guard the gnosis, the inner light cannot be extinguished. According to parallels with Gnostic texts about last teachings, Mary Magdalene would have said something similar to this: "My children, what I have taught you does not come from me. It comes from the Master whom I knew, loved, and who revealed to me the mysteries of the kingdom. He told me, "And now I tell you, the light you seek is not in stone temples raised by human hands. It is in the temple of flesh that you yourselves are. No one can give you this light because you have already possessed it since the beginning of time. You need only awaken to it. And when you awaken, do not allow anyone to tell you that you need intermediaries to reach the Father. He who says, 'Only through me will you reach God,' seeks to place himself in God's place. He who makes you fear your own direct connection with the divine is enslaving you." This teaching about gnosis, direct inner knowledge, was the foundation of everything else. It appears in the Gospel of Thomas, in the Gospel of Truth, in the Gospel of Philip. It was not a later invention. It was a central part of the original message that Mary Magdalene had received and was now transmitting to her children. Second key, the sacred love I knew with the Master lives in you. This teaching was the most dangerous to ecclesiastical authorities because it validated not only the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, but presented it as a sacred model of divine union. According to linguistic analyses of first-century Gnostic phraseology conducted by researchers at Claremont University, traditions about this teaching preserved a specific pattern. Mary Magdalene would have spoken of the sacred bridal chamber, a Gnostic concept that represented the union of divine opposites. Not simply a human marriage, but the reunification of the masculine Logos with the feminine Sophia. And she would have taught that Sarah and Maximin were the fruits of that sacred union, bearers of both divine natures in perfect balance. The love that the Master and I shared was not sin, though they will call it so, those who fear the power of the sacred feminine. It was the restoration of divine unity that existed before the world was divided into opposites. And you, my children, are living proof that the divine is not separated from the flesh. It is not confined to distant heavens. It walks on earth. It lives in blood. It is transmitted from generation to generation. You carry in your bodies the spark that unites heaven and earth. Do not allow anyone to tell you that you are less sacred for having been born of human union. You are more sacred precisely because of this. This teaching demolished the distinction that the institutional church was building between the pure spiritual and the corrupt carnal. If the union between Christ and Magdalene was sacred, if it produced divine descendants, then flesh was not the enemy of spirit. It was its vehicle, its expression, its continuation on earth. Third key, fear not those who persecute the body, protect the spirit. Mary Magdalene knew that persecution would come. She had already seen how Roman and Jewish authorities had crucified Jesus. She had already experienced the forced exile that brought her to France. She already knew that Christian communities were dividing between those who preserved the original teachings and those who built structures of institutional power. According to traditions preserved by Provençal communities, her last words included a prophetic warning. There will come a time when those who say they speak in the Master's name will persecute those who truly keep his teachings. They will burn books. They will destroy communities. They will kill the bearers of gnosis. They will say they do it for God, but they do it for earthly power. When that time comes, and it will come, do not fear the death of the body. The body is temporal. Gnosis is eternal. If 1,000 bearers of light die, the light itself cannot be extinguished, because it lives not in scrolls that can be burned, nor in temples that can be destroyed. It lives in every soul that awakens to its true nature. Protect the spirit, transmit the teaching, preserve the memory, and though 1,000 years of darkness pass, the light will eventually shine again. This prophecy was fulfilled with terrible precision. The Gnostics were persecuted in the 4th century. The Cathars were massacred in the 13th century. The Templars were destroyed in the 14th century. Every community that preserved these teachings was hunted, tortured, executed, but the light was not extinguished. Because Mary Magdalene had taught correctly, Gnosis does not live in institutions that can be destroyed. It lives in hearts that refuse to forget. And now, 2,000 years later, that light is emerging again. The secret guardians of knowledge. Mary Magdalene's words did not fall into the void. They were preserved by a secret network of guardians that extended for centuries, risking everything, their lives, their families, their entire communities, to keep alive the truth that authorities desperately wanted to erase. The first guardians were the Gnostic communities themselves of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. When Roman Emperor Theodosius III ordered the destruction of all texts considered heretical in the year 391 AD, these Gnostic Christians knew they possessed something too precious to allow it to be lost. The monks of the monastery of Nag Hammadi in Egypt took their complete libraries, 52 texts including Gospels of Mary Magdalene, Thomas, and Philip, and sealed them in ceramic jars. They buried them in desert caves, and they were executed for refusing to reveal where they had hidden them. Those jars remained hidden for 1,600 years until a peasant accidentally discovered them in 1945. But the Gnostics were not the only guardians. In the 11th century, the Cathars emerged in southern France, exactly in the region where traditions located Mary Magdalene and her children. This was not coincidence. The Cathars preserved oral traditions transmitted for centuries about the royal blood, about the lineage of Christ, about the beloved who guarded the mysteries. According to Inquisition documents studied by historians like Dr. Malcolm Barber of the University of Reading, the Cathars had a text they called the Book of Love, or the Gospel of Consolamentum. And according to testimonies extracted under torture, that book contained the last words of Mary, the beloved of the Lord. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade specifically to exterminate them. More than 1 million people were massacred in 20 years. The papal legate Arnaud Amaury pronounced the words that would define the massacre of Béziers: "Kill them all. God will recognize his own." 20,000 people were murdered in a single day. But before the fall of the last Cathar bastion at Montségur Castle in 1244, 4 men escaped in the dead of night, carrying the treasure of the Cathars. Not gold, documents, the texts that the church was desperate to destroy. They were never recovered, or they were found and destroyed in secret. But the teachings survived in oral memory. Then came the Templars. The Order of the Temple, officially founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, quickly became something far more mysterious. According to research by Dr. Margaret Starbird, a specialist in Messianic lineage symbolism, the Templars discovered something during their excavations under Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. Documents that spoke of Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene, texts that mentioned their descendants, evidence of the sacred lineage. And from that moment, the Templars developed a secret devotion to Mary Magdalene. They built cathedrals in her honor throughout France. They incorporated symbols of the sacred feminine in their architecture. They preserved the knowledge of the sang realtans, the royal blood, which was not a physical chalice but the lineage itself. The famous Cathedral of Chartres, financed by the Templars, contains more than 170 representations of the Virgin, but symbolic analyses reveal that many do not represent Mary, the mother of Jesus. They represent Mary Magdalene, encoded in the stones so that initiates could recognize her. In 1307, King Philip IV of France conspired with Pope Clement V to destroy the Templar order. All Templars in France were arrested simultaneously on Friday the 13th of October. They were tortured to confess heresies. Their properties were confiscated. Their leaders were burned at the stake. But before that date, the Templars knew betrayal was approaching. They evacuated their most important treasures, not gold but documents and knowledge, to Scotland and Portugal. And there, under new names and new forms, they continued their mission of protection, through Masonic lodges, through Rosicrucian societies, through esoteric orders that preserved knowledge in symbols and rituals, until today, because the guardians of the secret never disappeared completely. They simply became more discreet, and the teachings that Mary Magdalene transmitted to her children about the inner kingdom, about divine equality, about the universal sacred lineage, continue to be preserved, not in public institutions that can be attacked, but in individual hearts that refuse to forget. The Holy Grail, decoding the greatest secret. Now we come to one of the best-kept secrets of European history, the true meaning of the Holy Grail. For centuries, the quest for the Grail captured the imagination of kings, knights, mystics, and seekers. The popular narrative presents it as the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper, or the chalice that Joseph of Arimathea used to collect Christ's blood on the cross. But this literal interpretation was deliberately promoted to hide a much more dangerous secret. The Grail was never a physical object. It was a code, a metaphor, a symbol of something that ecclesiastical authorities were desperate to hide. The word Grail in medieval French was Sangreal or Sangral, but according to researchers of medieval etymology, this word can be divided differently, not Sangreal, Holy Grail, but rather Sangreal, royal blood. The Grail was not the cup. It was the lineage, the sacred blood of Christ continuing through generations. This interpretation appears veiled in the most important medieval literature about the Grail. Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach, written around 1210, describes the Grail as a stone that grants eternal life. Not a cup, a stone. And this stone is protected by a specific family that guards it from generation to generation. The text explicitly says that only those whose name is written on the stone can approach it. What does this mean? According to analyses of sacred lineage symbolism, the stone represents descendants, something solid, permanent, that is transmitted naturally from parents to children. And the names written on the stone are those who belong to the lineage by birth. Chrétien de Troyes, in his Percival or the Story of the Grail, written around 1190, presents the Grail even more cryptically. He describes it as an object that appears in a procession carried by a maiden. He does not specify that it is a cup. In fact, he never clearly describes its physical form. What he does describe is its effect. It grants life, healing, and perpetual sustenance, exactly what a sacred lineage would do, perpetuate divine life through generations. And crucially, the guardian of the Grail in the story is the Fisher King, a wounded king who can only be healed by the right knight. The Fisher King was a transparent medieval symbol for Christ. The fish, ichthys in Greek, was the secret symbol of early Christians. A wounded Fisher King who needs to be restored is the lineage of Christ that was attacked and needs to be recognized again. But there is more. The Grail legends are geographically concentrated in southern France, exactly where traditions located Mary Magdalene and her children. The routes that knights follow in their quest for the Grail pass through Provence, through Languedoc, through the same regions where the Cathars preserved traditions about the sacred blood. This is not coincidence. The medieval authors who wrote these stories were encoding in chivalric fiction a historical truth they could not express directly. And the Templars, who financed many of these literary works, were using the Grail narrative to preserve knowledge of the sacred lineage. The Holy Grail they sought was not a material treasure they could display. It was the recognition that Christ's lineage, initiated with Mary Magdalene and transmitted through Sarah and Maximin, continued to exist, protected by secret communities, and that the true purpose of this lineage was not to establish a political royal dynasty. It was to demonstrate that the divine flows through human blood, mixing with humanity until all potentially carry that sacred spark. That is why the quest for the Grail in medieval stories never ends with a knight finding it and displaying it triumphantly. It ends with understanding, with inner illumination, with the knight recognizing something within himself. Because the Grail is not out there waiting to be found. It is within. It has always been within. It is the recognition of your own divine nature, of your own connection with the sacred lineage that Mary Magdalene protected and transmitted. The words she spoke to her children were precisely about this, that they were not guardians of a mystical object, nor protectors of an exclusive dynasty. They were bearers of a truth that had to be sown widely, that all humans are the Grail. All humans carry the divine. All humans have direct access to the sacred source without need for institutional intermediaries. And this truth was so dangerous that it had to be hidden in metaphors of mystical chalices and chivalric quests for centuries. But now, in this time of revelation, the code is being deciphered, and the truth that Mary Magdalene taught is emerging from the shadows where it was forced to hide. Why the silence lasted 2,000 years. Now that you understand what Mary Magdalene taught and how it was preserved in secret, we need to face the most disturbing question. Why did this silence have to last 2,000 years? Why so much violence to suppress these teachings? Why were millions of people massacred, entire libraries burned, communities destroyed, just to keep hidden the truth about Mary Magdalene and her children? The answer is not theological, it is political, because what was at stake was not correct doctrine about Christ. It was absolute control over the masses through institutional religion. Imagine for a moment that you are a church leader in the 4th century. You have gone from being persecuted to being the official religion of the most powerful Roman Empire in the world. Your institution controls the interpretation of scriptures, administers sacraments, determines who is saved and who is condemned. Kings kneel before you. Emperors seek your blessing. Millions of people depend on your mediation for their eternal salvation. Your power is absolute. And that power is based on a very specific narrative that Christ was divine but celibate, that he had no earthly family after his death, that his body on earth is now the institutional church, that you as bishop or pope are the necessary intermediary between God and humanity, that without the sacraments that only your institution can administer, there is no salvation. This narrative gives you complete control over people's spiritual lives. And then, a rumor arrives. A rumor preserved in Gnostic communities that your institution could not completely destroy. A rumor that Jesus had a companion, that he had children, that this lineage continued and is being protected by secret communities. If this rumor is confirmed as truth, your power crumbles instantly. Because if Christ established a bloodline on earth, then the connection with the divine flows through descendants, not through your institution. If the sacred is transmitted from father to son, from mother to daughter, then why is a pope needed? Why bishops who determine doctrine? Why priests who administer controlled sacraments? If Mary Magdalene taught that the kingdom is within you and that each person has direct access to gnosis, then your entire structure of obligatory mediation becomes irrelevant. Worse still, it reveals itself as what it really is, not a path to God, but an obstacle. Not spiritual liberation, but institutional control. That is why the response could not simply be to disagree with these teachings. They had to be eradicated, completely, violently, without leaving a trace. In the year 591 AD, Pope Gregory I delivered the sermon that would transform Mary Magdalene for the next 400 years. According to papal documents preserved in Vatican archives, Gregory deliberately merged Mary Magdalene with the sinful woman of Luke 7 and with Mary of Bethany. There was no biblical evidence for this merger. The texts never say they are the same person, but with that papal declaration, Mary Magdalene was officially transformed into a repentant prostitute. Why? According to studies by Dr. James Carroll, a Catholic Church historian, this transformation served multiple political purposes. First, it neutralized her apostolic authority. A repentant prostitute could be venerated as an example of conversion, but never as a leader or teacher. Second, it justified the exclusion of women from ecclesiastical leadership. If the most important woman of early Christianity was a sexual sinner, then all women were suspect. Third, it eliminated any possibility of discussing her relationship with Christ. A prostitute could not have been his companion nor the mother of his children. Fourth, it transformed a theological threat into a tool of moral control. The prostitute Magdalene became the perfect symbol for preaching about sexual sin and repentance. This strategy worked perfectly for more than 1,000 years, but it was not enough, because texts still existed. Communities that knew the truth still existed. That is why the violence had to continue century after century. When the Gnostics preserved Gospels of Mary Magdalene in the 4th century, they were persecuted to extinction. Their libraries were burned, their leaders executed. When the Cathars taught about the sacred lineage in the 13th century, 1 million people were massacred in the Albigensian Crusade. When the Templars secretly venerated Magdalene in the 14th century, the entire order was destroyed, its members tortured and burned at the stake. The Inquisition operated for more than 600 years, specifically to hunt heresies that included any veneration of Mary Magdalene that went beyond the image of repentant prostitute. According to inquisitorial records studied by modern historians, one of the standard questions in interrogations was, "Do you believe that Mary Magdalene was an apostle or leader in the early church?" The correct answer, the only one that avoided torture, was no, she was a sinner forgiven by Christ, subordinate to the male apostles. Any other answer resulted in accusation of heresy. Possessing texts that presented Magdalene differently was punishable by death. Teaching that she had descendants with Christ was the most serious heresy possible. Why so much fear? Why so much violence? Because the teachings that Mary Magdalene transmitted to her children not only threatened ecclesiastical power, they threatened the entire system of control that had been built on the back of Christianity. If people awakened to the truth that the kingdom is within them, They don't need intermediaries to access God. The divine flows through humanity as universal lineage. They have inherent spiritual authority regardless of gender or hierarchy. Then not only would the church lose power, kings would lose their legitimacy based on divine right granted by bishops. Nobles would lose their control over peasants, who would awaken to their own divine dignity. The entire feudal structure of power that dominated Europe for centuries would crumble. That is why the silence about Mary Magdalene was not simply religious censorship. It was a massive social control operation that required the collaboration of political and religious institutions for 2 millennia. And it worked almost perfectly, until 1945, when an Egyptian peasant found the jars at Nag Hammadi, until independent scholars began analyzing texts without institutional pressure, until technology allowed information to flow faster than institutions' capacity to control it, until now. Until this moment, when you are hearing these words and recognizing deep within that what you have been told your entire life was an incomplete truth. The silence lasted 2,000 years because institutional power required that silence to survive. But that time has ended, because Mary Magdalene was right in her last words to her children. Though 1,000 years of darkness pass, the light will eventually shine again. We are living that shining, and no institution can stop it now. Your awakening, the prophetic call. We have traveled together on an extraordinary journey, from the caves of Saint-Baume, where Mary Magdalene spent her last years, through the 3 forbidden teachings she transmitted to Sarah and Maximin, through the centuries of brutal persecution against those who preserved her memory, to the code of the Holy Grail that revealed the true meaning of the sacred lineage. But now we come to the most important question of all. What does this mean for you? Why are these revelations emerging at this specific historical moment? And what are you supposed to do with this truth? First, you need to understand that you are not here by chance. You did not find this video by random algorithm. You did not arrive at this information out of simple intellectual curiosity. You are here because your soul recognizes something that was stolen from you long ago, the truth of your own divine nature. For 2,000 years you have been told that you are a sinner by nature, that you need intermediaries to access God, that your connection with the divine depends on external institutions that control sacraments and determine your salvation. But Mary Magdalene taught something completely different to her children, and that same teaching is for you today. The kingdom is within you, not in the future, not in heaven after death, not in a church you must visit, nor in a priest who must intercede for you. Within, now, always. The divine spark that Mary Magdalene and Christ shared, that was transmitted to Sarah and Maximin, that flowed through generations mixing with humanity, that spark lives in you. You don't need to belong to a specific genetic lineage to claim it, because the purpose of the lineage was never to create a separate elite. It was to sow the divine so widely in humanity that eventually all would recognize their sacred heritage. And that moment is coming, that moment is now. We are living in prophetic days when the hidden comes to light, when millions of people simultaneously are awakening to truths that were stolen from them, when institutions that maintained silence for centuries are losing their power of control, when information flows so quickly that censorship becomes impossible. Mary Magdalene spoke her last words, knowing this day would come, knowing that although her teachings were suppressed for millennia, they would eventually resurface at the exact moment when humanity was ready to receive them. That moment is this, and you are part of that awakening. But awakening is not passive. It is not simply accumulating fascinating information about hidden history. Awakening requires action. It requires transformation. It requires that you reclaim your spiritual authority. The 3 teachings that Mary Magdalene transmitted to her children were not only for them, they were for all who would eventually hear. First teaching, the kingdom is within you. It means you stop seeking spiritual validation in external institutions and begin to trust your direct inner connection with the divine. Second teaching, the woman who knows her essence is equal to man. It means you recognize that everyone, regardless of gender, race, social class, or religious affiliation, has equal access to the sacred. There are no divine hierarchies, only awakenings at different stages. Third teaching, the sacred blood continues on earth. It means you understand that the divine is not separated from the human. It is not confined to distant heavens. It walks with you, lives in you, flows through your very existence. When you internalize these three truths, something fundamental changes in you. You can no longer kneel before authorities who demand blind obedience. You can no longer accept doctrines that tell you that you are unworthy or sinful by nature. You can no longer allow institutions to stand between you and your divine source. You become spiritually free, and that freedom is what ecclesiastical authorities feared for 2,000 years. Because a spiritually free person cannot be controlled by fear of hell, by promises of institutional salvation, by threats of excommunication. A spiritually free person recognizes their own inner authority. And when millions of people awaken to that freedom simultaneously, control structures crumble. This is what is happening now. And you are part of that sacred collapse of old structures and the birth of a new spiritual consciousness. Mary Magdalene's last words to her children were a prophecy. Though 1,000 years of darkness pass, the light will eventually shine again. That light is shining in you, in millions of souls around the world who are awakening simultaneously. In every person who dares to question official narratives and seek truth beyond what they were taught. Mary Magdalene protected the sacred lineage with her life. Her children transmitted the teachings through centuries of persecution. The guardians preserved the knowledge when doing so meant death, all for this moment, so that you could hear these words and recognize the truth that has always lived within you. Now it is your turn. Now you become guardian of this truth. Not hiding it as was done in the past, because that time has ended, but sharing it openly, courageously, without fear. Living from your inner spiritual authority, recognizing the divine in yourself and in all you meet. Being yourself, the living continuation of the sacred lineage that Mary Magdalene protected. This is your awakening, your moment to recognize who you really are. Not a sinner who needs institutional salvation, but a bearer of the divine who has always had direct access to the source. Mary Magdalene's words to her children were for you. They always were for you. And now that you have heard them, you have a sacred responsibility. Live in that truth. Walk in that light. Be that freedom. Because when you do this, you become the answer to the prophecy that Mary Magdalene spoke with her last breath. You become the light that shines after 2,000 years of darkness. And nothing, no institution, no authority, no earthly power can extinguish that light again, because now it lives in you, conscious, awake, unstoppable, the deep meaning of global awakening. There is something profoundly significant happening at this moment in human history. It is not coincidence that these revelations about Mary Magdalene are emerging precisely now. It is not chance that millions of people around the world are simultaneously questioning official religious narratives. It is not luck that technology has made impossible the censorship that worked perfectly for 2 millennia. We are living the fulfillment of the prophecy that Mary Magdalene spoke on her deathbed. Though 1,000 years of darkness pass, the light will eventually shine again. That eventually is now. And you are not simply watching this awakening as a passive spectator. You are an integral part of it. Every time you question a doctrine that does not resonate with your inner truth, every time you refuse to accept that you need intermediaries to access the divine, every time you recognize your own sacred nature despite the voices that tell you that you are unworthy, you are fulfilling the mission that Mary Magdalene initiated 2,000 years ago. You are being the bearer of gnosis that guardians protected through centuries. You are living the truth that cost millions of lives to preserve. And this is not a light responsibility, but it is also not an impossible burden. Because the truth you carry does not require you to build temples, establish doctrines, or create new institutions. It requires only that you live authentically from your inner connection with the divine, that you recognize that same connection in all other human beings, that you refuse to allow any external authority to stand between you and your sacred source. That is all. And that is all that Mary Magdalene asked of her children. Not that they establish an alternative religion, not that they create a new hierarchy to replace the old one, simply that they live in truth, that they preserve the knowledge, that they transmit the light. And now, 2,000 years later, that light is spreading faster than ever in human history, because finally the moment has arrived when humanity is ready to release the crutches of institutions that promise external salvation. ready to recognize their own inner divinity, ready to walk in spiritual freedom without fear of punishment or threat of damnation. Mary Magdalene knew this day would come. That is why she endured exile, persecution, isolation. That is why she protected her children knowing they would be hunted. That is why she spoke her last words with prophetic certainty that eventually they would be heard. And now you are hearing them. Not because you are special in the sense of a separate elite, but because you are ready to awaken, ready to recognize, ready to live the truth. And there are millions like you around the world, in every country, in every culture, in every religious tradition. People who are simultaneously awakening to the same fundamental truth that the divine is not out there waiting for institutions to give you access. It is in here, it always has been, just waiting for you to recognize it. This is the global awakening that Mary Magdalene prophesied, and you are part of it, your role in the great revelation. So what do you do now with this information? How do you live this truth in a world that is still largely dominated by the same power structures that silenced Mary Magdalene? First, you live authentically from your inner truth. It doesn't mean you have to abandon all religious practice or reject all tradition. It means you filter everything through your own direct connection with the divine. If something resonates with your inner truth, you embrace it. If something contradicts your gnosis, you question it, no matter how authorized whoever teaches it may be. Second, you share the truth, but do not impose it. Mary Magdalene did not force her teachings on anyone. She offered them to those who were ready to hear. Similarly, you share what you have discovered with those who demonstrate they are seeking, but you respect each person's path, knowing that everyone awakens in their own time. Third, you recognize the divine in all, not only in those who share your beliefs, not only in those who have awakened to the same truth, but in every human being, because all carry the same sacred spark. This universal recognition is the essence of Mary Magdalene's teaching about the sacred lineage, that it is not exclusive to some but potential for all. Fourth, you live without fear of institutional authorities. They can no longer burn you at the stake. They can no longer confiscate your properties. They can no longer silence you with threats of eternal damnation, because you have recognized that your access to the divine does not depend on their approval, and that freedom is your spiritual birthright. Fifth, you become part of the global network of guardians, not through formal organizations or secret hierarchies, but simply by living the truth and recognizing it in others when you encounter it. The network of guardians was always strongest when it was decentralized, fluid, impossible to destroy, because it had no head to cut off, and you are now part of that network. The three promises of awakening. If you choose to walk this path of truth that Mary Magdalene initiated, there are three promises that the very experience of millions before you confirms. Promise 1. You will find inner freedom that no external circumstance can remove. Because when your access to the divine is direct and interior, no one can take it from you. They can take your possessions, they can threaten your body, they can reject your words, but they cannot touch your connection with the source. This freedom is what allowed Gnostic martyrs to sing while being burned. It is what allowed Cathars to die in peace, knowing the truth would survive. It is what allowed Templars to remain firm under torture. And it is what will allow you to remain in peace, no matter what external circumstances bring. Promise 2. You will recognize other bearers of light, not necessarily through shared words or doctrines, but through a silent recognition, a gleam in the eyes, a resonance in energy. You will discover you are not alone on this journey, that there is a global brotherhood of seekers, each on their own path, but all sharing the same fundamental truth. And when you meet them, in a casual conversation, in an online comment, in a glance in a crowd, you recognize the light in them, because you recognized the light in you. Promise 3. You will experience synchronicities that will confirm your path, because when you align with your inner truth, the universe conspires to support you. You will find the exact book you need at the precise moment. You will cross paths with the person who has the information you were seeking. You will experience coincidences that are too perfectly timed to be casual. This is not magic. It is simply what happens when you stop resisting the flow of your divine nature and begin to flow with it. Mary Magdalene experienced this. That is why she knew when to flee, where to hide, how to protect her children. The guardians throughout the centuries experienced this. That is why they knew where to bury the texts, when to evacuate the treasures, how to preserve the knowledge, and you will experience this too when you choose to walk this path. The final call. Mary Magdalene is calling you through the centuries, not as a deity to be worshipped, not as a saint to ask for intercession, but as an elder sister who walked this path before you and left markers for you to follow. She is calling you to recognize your own divine nature, to reclaim your spiritual authority, to live in inner freedom, to be bearer of the light she protected. The last words she spoke to her children were for you. The kingdom is within you. You are equal in divine essence to all others. The sacred blood, the connection with the divine, flows through you. These are not beautiful metaphors to contemplate intellectually. They are living truths to experience directly. And the moment to experience them is now. Not tomorrow when you are more prepared. Not after you read more books or learn more knowledge. Now, because you are already prepared. Otherwise you would not be here, hearing these words, feeling the resonance in your heart. Mary Magdalene waited 2,000 years for you to awaken. Her children transmitted the teachings through generations so you could receive them. The guardians risked their lives so this truth would survive until you. Do not disappoint them now by doubting your own capacity to carry this light. You are worthy. You have always been worthy. That unworthiness they taught you is the greatest lie you were told. You are living temple of the divine. You are bearer of the sacred spark. You are heir of the spiritual lineage that Mary Magdalene protected. And now it is your turn to protect it, not by hiding it as was necessary in the past, but by living it openly, courageously, magnificently, being the light that the world so desperately needs. This is your awakening. This is your call. This is your moment. Mary Magdalene's last words to her children are now yours. Live in truth. Walk in light. Be freedom. And when you do this, you will fulfill the prophecy she spoke with her last breath. Though 1,000 years of darkness pass, the light will eventually shine again. You are that light. Now shine. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any revelation. Don't miss the next video where we will continue unveiling truths that have remained hidden for centuries. And if you truly feel the call to go deeper, consider joining as a member. The Guardians of Truth are already accessing knowledge we can never make public. Thank you for accompanying me on this extraordinary journey through one of the most hidden truths of Christianity. Thank you for having the courage to question. Thank you for having the bravery to seek beyond official narratives. And thank you for being part of the global awakening that is transforming the consciousness of humanity in this prophetic moment. The words that Mary Magdalene spoke to her children were protected for 2,000 years, so you could hear them today, so you could recognize your own divine nature, so you could free yourself from the chains of narratives that kept you separated from your sacred source. Now you live in that knowledge. Now you walk in that truth. Now you are conscious guardian of the teaching she protected with her life. We'll see each other in the next video, where the revelation continues. Until then, walk in light, live in truth, and never forget. The divine is not in distant temples, nor in institutions that control. The divine is in you. It always has been. It was just waiting for you to awaken. May the light you discovered today illuminate every step of your path. May the truth you recognized transform every aspect of your life. And may the divine spark you carry inspire all whom you encounter. Until the next video, walk in light.